Welcome to Talking Business, a podcast produced in Melbourne, Australia. The podcast is available on the Acast site, my own website, the Apple Podcast Store, or wherever you go to get your podcast. Or you can get it at the Business Acumen website at www.businessacumen.biz. I am Leon Gettler. My job is to review and monitor the week's news in business, finance and economics. I bring it all to you every week. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from my website, leongettler.com, or whatever your favourite podcast platform is. This is episode number 34 in our series for 2025, and today's date is Friday, October the 3rd. First, I'll be talking to Dr. Tim Currie, the CEO of Nova, which provides onshore and nearshore IT services. We'll be talking about why Gen Z are talking away from remote work, how business leaders need to think carefully about workplace design when setting up remote workplaces and become influencers there, and work out exactly how return-to-work regimes can operate. And I'll be talking to RMIT economist Sinclair Davidson on why universities don't and shouldn't work as businesses. But first, let's talk to Dr. Currie.
Well, Dr. Currie, why are younger employees having trouble with remote work?
Well, like I think everyone who works remotely, they enjoy the autonomy and they enjoy the flexibility. But young workers, entry-level workers, or young workers that are just beginning their career path, they still want all the things that I think most people experienced when they were in their 20s or in their early career days. They want mentorship, they want deep interpersonal relationships, they want to feel belonging and identity with something, and they also want to see a career path, right, that for themselves through what they do all day. And a lot of times remote work, the nature of remote work, and in some cases the nature of the work that's given to them remotely isn't meeting those needs.
It's sort of like when you go from school to university, suddenly you're on your own.
A bit, yes. And look, once you know what you're doing, I think the difference with workers that are a little bit older or a little bit more established in their career is that both in their like personal and social life as well as their work life, they're more secure, more established, don't need as much infrastructure and scaffolding as maybe a younger worker needs, and their personal lives become a little more paramount to them, so they can effectively compartmentalize the work life, and they don't have as hard a time with it.
So what you need there is a hybrid structure, surely.
Yeah, I mean, look, certainly, commuting an hour and a half to the office each way and spending all day in an office certainly had its own drawbacks. but in order to get some of that back, I mean, there are things that you can do to create a community digitally and create belonging and create connection. It's not easy, it's a lot of work, but you kind of you can't schedule innovation for 3 o'clock on a Tuesday. If you're going to recreate the things that used to happen in the office, the dynamism, the innovations, the sharing of ideas, and certainly for younger workers, exposure to sort of the social norms and the way things work in both the organization and the world, you have to work in some sort of in-person work. It would seem, certainly the research is suggesting that you need to work that in somehow in some sort of hybrid environment.
Hybrid environment can be anything from say working 3-4 days a week, or it can be doing it remotely, having sessions remotely with people online.
Sure. Yeah, I think it depends on what aspect. If we're focusing on young workers, right, or young and entry level workers, I think there's some things that cannot be done remotely, at least to the same level and effectiveness as they had been done in the past. And by the past, like, think about it. I think research varies, but basically it was the invention of the typewriter that led to what we would consider the business office dynamic, right? The idea of pooling people together that can perform tasks, and work at scale, the operations of the business. And that was the beginning that's 200 years ago. So for 200 years, a large construct of our society, our business, our, socio-economical infrastructure had revolved around at least part of your life spent in an office. That could be healthcare, that could be business, that could be educational, government, but it was an office. And, to sort of strip all that away and say, well, we can kind of do it all remotely. You can do tasks remotely. You can achieve collective goals remotely. But some of for young workers, getting mentorship, building a network of interpersonal relationships, that's both, think about it, your chain of command is important, but so are also all the other relationships that used to be developed because you had proximity, right? So you're right. It can vary, but what's most important and where we see people failing at return to office now is in organizational design. So there's nothing worse than commuting an hour and a half to an office where you then have to Zoom with someone who's working in another office or working from home, right? So it's the worst of both worlds. You have the commute and the overhead without any of the satisfaction or any of the any of the fulfillment or the scaffolding that comes with it. Used to always come with working in an office. We've become this very virtualized world. We've become a very virtualized organizational design, and even more so in the tech industry more recently, organizing around verticals, not geographic regions. And I don't think a lot of organizations have put the sort of intentional thought, I live near Chicago. If I'm going to take the train in an hour to the work, I better be talking and working and sitting with other people that are in my team, that are essential to me getting my job done, that are local to Chicago, and probably talking about, I'm in, consulting in my day job. I want to be dealing with, maybe Chicago clients, right? Like, so that's the kind of intentional thought to hybrid structure that is lacking in a lot of bigger organizations that have just for years been very virtual, even though they had people that were, sort of co-located in offices.
So when we talk about hybrid, we're also talking about face-to-face interactions.
Yeah, face-to-face interactions are absolutely paramount. And again, speaking, of course, about entry level and younger employees, it's almost, I won't say almost impossible, but it's incredibly difficult, and it's incredibly sort of uncharted waters to give a younger employee, an entry level employee, an enriching experience, an enriching career path where they can see how people interact. They can see what norms are reinforced by the well, what does it really mean to have an organizational culture? It's what you see, hear, and do and experience when you interact with peers, with management, with leadership, when you observe others. Observational learning doesn't really happen when you're on a Zoom with your camera off for 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
So these are the things that have to get sort of integrated back into our work life.
I've noticed that with some people who are working remotely, and they have a job of managing someone, and they don't manage to do it because they are working remotely. And I mean, I think that's quite an issue. That's something I've noticed in my work.
It is interesting. So Microsoft had a study during the pandemic that's become rather famous, and it was during the pandemic, 87% of employees felt they were highly productive working remotely, and only 12% of their managers thought those same employees were being highly productive. Which begs the question, what changed, right? So, because again, in the tech industry, we've always been sort of hybrid. And I think part of the answer lies in the fact that those individual managers may have never had to manage people exclusively remote, right? They always had a way of whether it was hybrid or whether it was some sort of function where you observe them in person, but also they were surrounded. If we think about the unicorns of the U.S. tech industry in particular, your Microsofts, your Facebooks, your Googles, your Amazons, they're surrounded by all this sort of like supportive structure, the supportive environmental, work culture. Once you're not hanging out in the Google offices with the baristas and the nap pods, there's nothing but the task, right? There's nothing but the task in front of you. And so I think there's some stripes of managers that have become taskmasters, which couldn't lead to micromanagement. And remote work without autonomy is not a very exciting prospect for a lot of people. So, those are the things that haven't been balanced out.
Yeah,
right?
and frankly, it's not that productive.
It's not that productive. I think there's, we see all these studies about remote work productivity, and I think there's a red herring in there. I think that what people think is productivity is very much, they're thinking, 2 + 2 = 4, and are my tasks done? Are my projects being done? Are people doing what I've asked of them and delivering on time? Well, that's a very transactional relationship, and that doesn't build deep interpersonal connections. It doesn't build trust. It doesn't build the type of connective tissue that gets an organization through tough decisions, tough times. And it also is something that's very easily replaced on both ends, both the worker and the employer. So if you're a young worker or entry level worker early in your career, you're not going to find a lot of, and that's the world you're living in. You're not going to find a lot of satisfaction out of it.
And so, what must leaders do to repair that engagement and prevent this long-term cultural erosion?
It's a good question. I think there's probably 3 areas that organizations need to focus in both my research and my experience. One is the digital, how you build a digital community basically within your organization. There's in the tech industry, we laugh about, hey, I just got an email that says someone sent me a message on Microsoft Teams. Like, that's not how that's supposed to work, right? You're supposed to have a digital platform where you're sort of interacting real time and collectively. So what I mean by that is no more copy all emails. Don't send an email when a message, a Slack message or a Teams message will do. Don't ask people to respond when an emoji will do. And start to think about how you're engaging and building a community digitally. And so in my research, I found that, when we talk about leadership, there are three big elements that almost universally drove, trust in leadership in 100% remote organizations. The first was availability of management, meaning like when I'm online at 8 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, do I see that little green light on their avatar? Do I know that they're working too? Right. The second is responsiveness. So if I see them and I ping them, do they come back in a timely and manner, and are they interested and concerned in me? That would seem like a very small thing, but when you don't have as many avenues to engage with leadership, those little things get remembered. And then the third biggest reflection of leadership trust was how well they engage in non-work channels. So, are they in the channel talking trash about the sport, about our sports teams and our sports rivalries? Are they sharing pictures of their kids? They took their daughter to the Swiftie Taylor Swift concert, so they're in the Swiftie channel. Like those types of things create authentic moments where we reveal other sides of ourselves. And that's generally how people tend to, learn about people, learn to trust. So how you build that digital community when you are remote is incredibly important, both in building like a corporate culture, and people can feel belonging. People can feel part of something, in a digital environment like that. The second part is what we talked about earlier, which is the intentional work design, right? So a lot of thought has to go into when I do make people come into the office, whether it's 1 day, 2 days, 4 days, or 5 days, I have to put a lot of thought into what their experience is going to be, because you can't schedule innovation for 3 o'clock on a Tuesday. So I need to create a world in which it's dynamic, it's enriching, and it drives innovation. And, from a leadership perspective, I've been in the tech industry for a couple decades and been part of a lot of fast growth tech companies. And I've had the benefit of working for a lot of transformational and inspirational leaders. They're very good in the front of the room. They're very good walking the halls. They have a presence about them. They're inspirational. But if you're remote, there aren't any halls. There is no room, right? So you have to almost become an influencer to your own company. You have to drop little videos. You have to, share, hey, I'm in New York today doing whatever, and, and encourage others to share authentically back, right? So try, those are the types of things that leaders have to do to kind of get us over the hump. And it's easier said than done, because you've got different personas and different positionality of your different employees. The older, more established employees, they might not care, right? They can do their job. They're happy. They feel fulfilled because they have the autonomy to do what they're good at in the time that they want to. But you need to get a broader experience there.
Well, Dr. Currie, that's all quite instructional and quite fascinating. And,
it's a lot.
It's a lot. It certainly is, and a lot to think about. And thank you so much for your time.
Sure thing, Leon. It was a lot of fun. It was great to meet you.
And now let's talk to our MIT economist, Dr. Sinclair Davidson. Well, Sinclair, there's been a whole lot of issues of universities and their financial constraints and getting rid of staff and trying to run themselves as businesses, but not very successfully. What's your view about that?
The challenge facing universities really is that they're actually not designed to be run like businesses. They're not intended to be commercial. And so they actually have a governance system that's designed to run a not-for-profit, and they are trying to run themselves on commercial basis. So we actually have this sort of engineering disconnect between how universities are intended to be operated and how universities are operated. Now, this is actually quite an important argument, because a lot of people think, just another academic not wanting to be accountable and all this sort of stuff. But in actual fact, the organizational forms that we've had that have evolved over hundreds of years have evolved for specific purposes. And we know, given the characteristics of what is higher education, that running it in a for-profit environment is actually going to lead to the kind of sillinesses that we've seen, as opposed to running it properly in a not-for-profit environment as a not-for-profit. So this isn't an argument against rational decision-making. This is an argument against inappropriate decision-making that I believe is happening to the Australian universities.
I see Flinders University has just got rid of their School of Humanities.
Yes, quite astonishing, actually, if you kind of think that this is what a university university actually does. The humanities is kind of why you would think about a university education being interesting and important. You know, in the bad old days, it was sort of rhetoric and grammar and ancient Greek is what people actually learned at universities. Good luck trying to do that these days.
And your field of economics is not quite a science, but it's science and humanities.
Yes. Luckily, however, in the field that I'm in, it tends to be incredibly profitable. So in the profit-driven university, we kind of are less likely to be chopped. Although, given our sort of our related disciplines of, say, marketing and finance, they're more likely to be profitable than economics. But nonetheless, business studies are, given how profitable they are less likely to be sort of chopped as in, say, the humanities, where you're kind of shutting down an entire degree program is quite an astonishing decision. Now, the other challenge that's happened with the commercialization of universities is the excessive centralization of universities. And the challenge with centralization is that we know from economics that there's this thing called local knowledge and tacit knowledge that's very important to make decisions at the local level. Now, what happens is businesses tend to solve this problem through decentralization, whereas universities have become overly centralized over the last few years. So all that tacit knowledge and local information is kind of being boiled out of the system. And so again, not only do we have inappropriate decision making, we have exactly wrong decision making occurring because of this commercial emphasis that people have taken on.
Well, the over-centralisation actually explains the incredible bureaucracy in universities.
Yes. It's quite astonishing. If you look at the average university now, more than 50% of the staff of a university will be in bureaucratic positions. So they will not be academics. If you have a look at the academic population, let's say 45% of the academic population, of those, there's going to be a whole bunch of who themselves are in administrative positions as academic administrators. And then every single academic has about a 20% loading in their own work plan as to doing academic work. So if you want to see how much non-academic work is taking place in the university, add up all the bureaucrats, then add up about, let's say, 5% of academics, and then add up 20% of all the other academic time spent on bureaucracy, which basically means that about 40% of the staff are actually generating the work that where the universities actually add value. So a lot of the rest of it is make work and compliance work and silliness.
And a lot of that goes down to the KPIs of the academics on which they're assessed all the time.
Yes. You know, so you have a KPI. Have you filled out this form? What does this form actually do? Well, nobody's quite sure.
So this is quite extraordinary because universities were originally there for community purposes.
Yes, to provide an education. So if you kind of think the universities or the institutions that we now recognize as being universities are about 1,000 years old. So starting from the University of Bologna in Italy and Oxford and Cambridge and so on and so forth, they actually started off sort of to train the clergy and to train lawyers and these sorts of things to provide an alternative to the monasteries. So a university has actually got a very important educational role within society that goes beyond just training people to do a job of work. And unfortunately, we've sort of fallen into this world where now universities are training people to do a job of work as opposed to providing a general education. And of course, unfortunately, it's also become big business. So we actually have a situation now where the universities are too big to fail because they are so important for an economy. If you look at Melbourne, for example, we are a university town. Now, people don't think of Melbourne as being a university town, but we've got 7 or 8 universities headquartered in Melbourne. Plus, we have several other universities with branch campuses in Melbourne. We're a university town. If any one of those universities were to get into serious trouble, the Victorian economy would be in serious trouble. So it becomes a case of too big to fail, combined with it because of the non-profit nature, it's a zero-sum game, combined with excessive centralization and corporatization. So the zero-sum game bit is also quite important because that means for the universities to do well, they have to more or less steal. And we've seen the stealing from the staff in terms of wage theft. We see stealing from students in terms of fee theft. We see decline of services being offered to students. At the same time, a well-known Sydney university flew their senior management to Europe, a business class 2 weeks ago, for a cocktail party with alumni. You know, so it kind of, you've got to wonder where their priorities are.
One could say the the same about ANU.
You could indeed, yes, 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 yes. They've gotten themselves into the most astonishing trouble, and it's hard to understand why ANU is struggling so much because, unlike every other university in Australia, the ANU actually gets a grant directly from the federal government to run. About half of that particular university, the research component, is funded directly by the federal government through a grant.
What's extraordinary about ANU is it was originally set up as a research university.
Yes, yes. So half of it is research university, and the other half sort of teaches students, which of course is entirely appropriate. I mean, I'm not a big fan of research only universities, and I'm not a big fan of teaching only positions. I certainly believe that you have to have that mix and balance of both research and teaching in order to qualify as being a university. The ANU's research component is partly funded directly by the federal government, and that's sort of a nation building sort of exercise function of the ANU. But the rest of it, more or less, universities are funded by our student fees that we charge, and then Australian students are then subsidized by the federal government. So it's actually a subsidy to Australian students, not Australian universities per se.
The interesting part is that universities are now totally beholden on overseas students.
Yes, to a large extent, yes, yes. And that easy money has actually allowed universities to sort of be more spending and sort of wasteful than they otherwise would have been, because the argument has always been, oh, gee, if we need money, we'll just take another 10, 20 international students, and that will sort of give us the revenue for whatever it is that we want. And the very famous American economist Michael C. Jensen wrote about this in the 1980s when he had a theory of excess free cash flow. So he said, what happens is diversified organizations have excess free cash flow, no incentive to sort of steward it well, and so they waste it. And of course, what is the very definition of a diversified organization? A modern university. We're astonishingly diversified in terms of the different types of activities that we do. Now, you might think that teaching a science student is exactly the same as teaching a business student, is exactly the same as teaching an art student, but in actual fact, these are very different activities. And yet we have a one-size-fits-all model for all of these.
The good thing about overseas students is that they pay straight away.
Yes, they pay up front, and they pay exorbitant amount of fees. I very often feel that we actually treat our international students badly, not just as a university because we charge them so much, but almost as a state, because these guys are viewed as pure cash cows for almost everything. And you kind of think, you try to make a good impression, and yet nonetheless, we treat international students as pure cash cows, take advantage of them at every opportunity. And very often I feel we're doing the wrong thing.
So what's the future of Australian universities?
So I think the interesting challenge is how the federal government responds to the Senate inquiry that's just come out, and how universities respond to the Senate inquiry that's just come out. The problem that I have with the Senate inquiry that's just come out is that it's incredibly overly focused on governance as compliance with regulation. Whereas in actual fact, governance is about treating the stakeholders in your organization appropriately and running your organization appropriately. That Senate inquiry completely ignores the point of asking the question, who is the university's customer and what is the product that the university is providing? And I think you've got to start from that point and work backwards. So we have setting up committees, we have increasing the powers of TEXA, we have more ticker box compliance. They're definitely going to do something about vice chancellor salaries. They're going to set up a remuneration tribunal, which is just more bureaucracy. I would just cap it. These guys get paid no more than $500,000, and just see what happens next. So we're going to have an incredible bureaucratic process where everybody's running around. I'm not quite sure. There's no middle class anger towards universities in Australia like there is in the United States. So I'm not quite sure that we're going to see good reforms just yet, but certainly I think the notion of the overly centralized, commercialized, bureaucratized university is simply not sustainable.
Well, Sinclair, that's all going to be fascinating to watch, and thank you very much for your time.
Going to be lots of fun to watch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what's happening in the news? Well, US President Donald Trump has announced he will impose a 100% tariff on all foreign-made movies. Yes, it's an unprecedented move that threatens Hollywood's global business model. It also raises uncertainty for studios that depend heavily on international box office revenue and cross-border co-productions. Mr. Trump announced the measures in a post on his Truth Social platform, claiming US movie making was losing ground to international competition. Our movie-making business has been stolen from the United States of America by other countries, just like stealing candy from a baby, he wrote. However, it was not immediately clear what legal authority Mr. Trump would use to impose a 100% tariff on foreign-made films. Studio executives say they're flummoxed by how a movie tariff might be enforced, given that modern films often use production, financing, post-production and visual effects spread across multiple countries. Examples include Mad Max, The Grey Man, Body of Lies, Rush, Red Notice, Casino Royale, Diamonds Are Forever and The Bourne Identity. The move has drawn scepticism from legal and trade analysts. Some argue films are a form of intellectual property and part of global trade and services, an area where the US often runs a surplus, raising questions about the legal basis for tariffs. Co-productions with foreign studios have also become more common, adding to doubts about how such films will be classified. And the Reserve Bank of Australia Board has warned inflation is on track to exceed its forecasts, so it's left the cash rate on hold at 3.6%. Announcing the unanimous decision on Tuesday, the board said in a statement that the decline in underlying inflation had slowed since its August meeting. In other words, it's higher than expected. No surprises then that everyone expected the RBA board to leave the cash rate on hold at 3.6% at Tuesday's meeting, following the release of hotter than expected monthly inflation data last week. Those figures showed a pickup in price pressures across the services sector. The result? Some economists have concluded that the central bank might not cut the cash rate again until next year. Bond markets view the prospect of a rate cut at the RBA's November 3rd to 4th meeting as no more than a coin toss. Traders now expect the RBA will leave the cash rate on hold until its February the 2nd and 3rd board meeting. At a regular post-meeting press conference, RBA Governor Michelle Bullock said you mightn't get it right. She said she could envision rates being on hold for the foreseeable future and where they need to be cut again. So what does that mean? What we're focusing on is an interest rate path that will deliver us inflation sustainably in the band, she said, batting away repeated attempts to pin her down. That could mean a couple more reductions. It might not. I don't know at this point, and we'll look at all this again in November. Go figure. And will Australia and the European Union strike a landmark trade deal? Maybe. Europe's trade chief is heading to Canberra for talks this month with senior government officials to try to steal a pact that Labor is pitching as an antidote to Donald Trump's tariff spree. There is a renewed optimism about the free trade negotiations after Prime Minister Anthony Albanese used last week's United Nations General Assembly in New York to lobby French President Emmanuel Macron and other European leaders over the trade deal after France and Ireland objected to market access for Australian beef and lamb. During a meeting with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez in London on Friday, Albanese appeared confident a European free trade deal worth $156 billion was in sight, telling him he felt really hopeful about the pact and that negotiations were progressing quite well. Trade Minister Don Farrell met EU Trade Commissioner Maros Sefcovic in Kuala Lumpur last week and invited him to Australia for meetings in late October, marking the first negotiations on Australian shores. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has invited Indian-owned Abu Dhabi hypermarket chain Lulu, carrying Australian items like Vegemite, meat, fruit and vegetables, selling cheaper than what you'd pay in Australia, to come here and challenge Coles and Woolworths. Mr Albanese confirmed the invitation to Lulu hypermarket chairman Yusuf Ali while on a pit stop through the United Arab Emirates as a free trade agreement with a Middle Eastern nation takes force. One of the great things about the Lulu Group chairman's company, there are 300 supermarkets just like this one. I've encouraged him to come to Australia as well, Mr Albanese said. We need more competition in the Australian supermarket sector, and we've had a little discussion about that. Lulu Hypermarket is one of the largest retail chains in the Middle East, across the Gulf states and elsewhere. This company is big enough to have direct relations with Australian producers, whether they be mango producers, the orange producers, the meat producers, that the chairman met in Mudgee, that are still providing halal certified meat into this market, Mr Albanese said. The Prime Minister said the free trade agreement would remove tariffs on nearly all Australian exports to the UAE, as well as increase investment from the oil-rich nation's massive sovereign wealth funds into Australia. The supermarket sector faced intense scrutiny through the previous term of the government, as product price increases compounded with other cost of living pressures. The consumer watchdog has found Australian supermarkets are more profitable than their global peers, and the two majors don't need to compete vigorously. But the ACCC stopped short of declaring grocery prices excessive. Critics argue that the sector was too concentrated in the hands of just two players. Coles and Woolworths which was leading to a lack of competition and distorted prices. Singtel Chief Executive Wan Kwan Moon and Optus Chief Stephen Rue have blamed Optus staff for 000 outages that have been linked to 3 deaths. Federal Communications Minister Anika Wells this week confronted the Singtel and Optus bosses at the federal government's offices in Sydney to say the outages were unacceptable. She made it clear she could trust the 2 Optus guys as far as she could throw them, in other words, not at all. She said Optus must appoint an independent external advisor to oversee its business. One fronted the media on Tuesday for the first time since the telco group's 2 outages over the past 11 days to say Optus was investigating the cause of the most recent outage in New South Wales on Sunday. He couldn't exactly explain why it happened, but he knew who to blame. A previous outage of Optus 000 networks in 4 states on September the 18th, he said, was due to a step that was missed by someone at Optus, a process issue, a people issue that didn't follow the proper steps. One told the media that Sunday's outage was a different issue, but asked about the meeting with the minister, Optus chairman John Arthur said he couldn't explain exactly what Wells meant by external accountability. He denied lack of investment resulted in the failures, laying the blame instead on Optus staff. And Liberal Party women are warning that the party will alienate more women and young people if it abandons net zero. The party is publicly fracturing over its energy policy, with Andrew Hastie threatening to quit the front bench if a coalition embraces net zero. As a result, 3 high-profile current and former senior Liberal women have warned going backwards in climate action will only hurt the party more with key demographics. Maria Kovacic, recently promoted to Susan Lee's shadow ministry, said women and younger people had already abandoned the party at the last election. Abandoning net zero is unpopular with women and it's unpopular with young people, and I don't think that's news to anyone, she said. It's why people walked away from us in metropolitan areas. We can pretend that other things are afoot, but that was the reality. Jane Hume, who was relegated from front bench by Lay, has become one of the most outspoken advocates for net zero and the push to bring more women into the party. The former shadow finance minister said the party should not be focusing on the seats it now holds, but the 33 seats it needs to win back. The electorate has told us time and time again at elections and even in the most recent news poll they care about climate and want to see action, she said. We need to actually show those Australians that not only have we heard the message, but we agree with it. The former Cabinet Minister, Karen Andrews, also called on the party to take climate action seriously if it wants more women to join its ranks. If they, the Liberal Party, want to regain government, they're going to have to take seriously the issues that women and young people, but particularly women, are concerned about, she said. One of those issues that is front of mind for so many women is climate change. And a surge in income and company taxes has pushed federal government revenue to its biggest share of the economy in almost a quarter of a century. The final budget outcome for 2024-25 showed the government collected $717 billion in revenue last financial year. That's $13 billion more than was forecast at the pre-election economic and fiscal outlook in April. Treasury is reaping a multi-year revenue windfall, with overall tax and non-tax revenue rising to 25.9% of gross domestic product, much more than Treasury's forecast of 25.3% and the highest since 2000 and 2001 when the GST was introduced. Tax collections are unexpectedly held steady at 23.7% of GDP last financial year, despite the stage 3 tax cuts coming into effect and underscoring the strength of the ongoing income and company tax windfall. The extra cash drove a $17 billion improvement in the budget bottom line compared to April, with the federal government recording a narrower than expected underlying deficit of $10 billion. The underlying deficit figure does not include the $11.8 billion in so-called off-budget spending last year in areas such as the Snowy Hydro project and loss-making assets like the National Broadband Network and the Whyalla Steelworks. Including the off-budget spending, the government's headline deficit was $21.8 billion, also better than forecast. Higher than expected commodity prices delivered an extra $5.3 billion in company taxes compared to Treasury's forecast, while the strong jobs market saw income tax collections beat expectations by $3.4 billion. Strong investment earnings helped the government collect an extra $2.9 billion in taxes from superannuation funds. And Treasury has forecast that real government spending is on track to rise 6% in 2024-25, far higher than the 3.4% average rate recorded in the 2 decades before the pandemic. Treasury predicts that spending as a share of GDP will rise to 27% in 2025-26. Outside the pandemic, that would be the highest level of spending since 1985-86. Treasury expects gross debt, which stands at $960 billion, to surpass $1 trillion sometime this financial year. This month, the Parliamentary Budget Office warned that the budget would remain in deficit for the next decade and return to balance in 2035-36 solely as a result of bracket creep, causing workers to pay rising rates of income tax. On the spending side of the budget, the PBO report highlighted the persistent long-term structural pressures from the $52 billion National Disability Insurance Scheme, rising health cost pressures to increase defence spending, government debt interest and measures to tackle climate change. And Treasurer Jim Chalmers says the government is no rush to roll out a road user charging system amid concerns the tax could discourage consumers from buying electric vehicles as major car brands scale back their EV investment due to slow consumer uptake. The Climate Change Authority has said more than 50% of all new cars sold in the next decade must be EVs if the Albanese government is to reach its goal of reducing carbon emissions by 62 to 70% on 2005 levels by 2035. The federal government is working with the states on a road user charging strategy as it seeks to replace the revenue from fuel excise that will be lost in the transition to EVs. Chalmers said on Monday that a key consideration was ensuring any road user charge did not deter the uptake of EVs. We want to see more and more people take up the opportunity of an electric vehicle, he said. In most of the discussions we have publicly and privately, and with the states and with others, we're very conscious of finding the right balance, getting the sequence right, so that we can continue to encourage people into an EV with the tax cuts that we are providing. But we will also be conscious that as we implement over time, we're in no rush. As Chalmers' comments were a significant change in tone from the Productivity Roundtable in August, where the idea of a road user tax for EVs was discussed and received broad support. Unable to compete with Chinese EVs on performance and price, some of Australia's top car brands are scaling back their EV investments, citing slow consumer uptake. Tony Webber, Chief Executive of the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries, said he was criticised for being conservative when he predicted in early 2024 that EV penetration would be at only 14% by 2024. Yet, it is only 8% now. It is clear that expectations from governments for rapid EV uptake have not been met in many markets, Webber said. The car industry is spending billions of dollars in research and development